Book 9 of Plato's Republic begins by continuing the discussion of tyranny from the end of Book 8. Having finished the discussion of the tyrannical political constitution, Socrates turns to his discussion of the tyrannical type of man, which in part has already been anticipated in Book 8. In order to do this, Socrates proposes that it is necessary to examine the nature and the number of our appetites. The main division he is concerned to draw here is between what he calls the lawless appetites and what he calls the better appetites. Individuals differ in relation to such appetites. Quote, in a few people they have gotten rid of entirely these lawless appetites, or only a few weak ones remain, while in others they are stronger and more numerous. That's at 571b, page 387. Socrates examines the nature of these appetites. This is at 571c through e, page 387, in the bottom of the left-hand column towards the top of the right. Plato writes, referring to these lawless appetites, they are the ones that wake up when we are asleep, whenever the rest of the soul, the rational, gentle, and ruling element, slumbers. When the bestial and savage element, full of food or drink, comes alive, casts off sleep, and seeks to go and gratify its own characteristic instincts. You know it will dare to do anything in such a state, released and freed from all shame and wisdom. In fantasy, it does not shrink from trying to have sex with a mother or anyone else, man, god, or beast. It will commit any foul murder, and there is no food it refuses to eat. In a word, it does not refrain from anything, no matter how foolish or shameful. So these are the lawless or irrational appetites, the bestial and even more than bestial, often sort of demoniacal appetites that are willing to cross normal boundaries of propriety and morality. These are revealed in sleep, especially in the sleep of the irrational man. By contrast, the rational man keeps his irrational appetites in check. Such a man, he says, quote, awakens his rational element before going to sleep, unquote, and another quote, feasts it on fine arguments and investigations. So if you want to avoid having embarrassing dreams, Plato seems to be saying here, it seems like, first of all, you should make sure that you have an empty stomach before you go to bed, because these lawless appetites are aroused if you have just eaten and your stomach is full of food and drink. But then also feast your mind on fine arguments and investigations before you go to bed. And in a similar way, the rational man will calm the spirited side. So the rational man, in other words, calms the appetitive element in his soul and stimulates the rational element in which wisdom arises before he goes to sleep, so he doesn't have this bestial and savage element take over in his soul when he's asleep. Nevertheless, the existence of these terrible, savage, and lawless appetites does become clear in sleep. They do exist. And this suggests that all human beings, at least initially, have such appetites. These are the kinds of things that Sigmund Freud would later associate with the id. So the tyrannical man is the person who is controlled by, we might say anachronistically, his id, more than the rational part of his soul. And we can appreciate what this would be like because most of us have in our lives at least some experience of dreams in which this element of the soul was given full reign. And so you have a sense of what the inner life of the tyrannical man is like. That seems to be Plato's point here. Now, back to this general framework. Remember, Plato is operating on this, what I was calling earlier, a dialectical presupposition that the lower forms, both of the city and of the psyche, devolve from an inner contradiction in the higher forms. And so the timocratic or honor-loving type derives from the philosophical type, and out of the timocratic type develops the oligarchical type, and so on down the line. And so the tyrannical man is going to develop from the democratic type. The democratic man, you'll recall, was led into all types of licentious behavior in the name of freedom, which is the great love of the democratic type of person, freedom. However, as Plato frames the story, there is a trajectory. Plato is realistic in this sense, in that there's a trajectory from youth to middle age to old age in the democratic man. And eventually, even as the democratic man grows older, his passion cools a bit and his lawless appetites are balanced out by more moderate ones. So that's the picture. But now Plato says, well, imagine this man has a son. He should expect that the son will follow in his father's footsteps and indulge his lawless appetites when he's young. So this is the middle-aged democratic man looks at his son partying too much probably and just says, boys will be boys. I remember when I was young, I can't really criticize my son for, smoking weed or whatever, because that's what I did when I was young, and maybe I still do it a little bit on the side, right? So that's the situation, basically. However, in his case, the young man's elders face the challenge of having to face opposition from those who want to seduce the youth to indulgence in lawlessness. So Junior is, engaging in, maybe he's drinking beer first with his friends, underage, shouldn't be doing it, smoking weed, whatever. But meanwhile, there are these people hovering around who want maybe to introduce Junior to, let's say, heroin or meth or something harder, right? That's the picture. And so what's dad going to be able to do in relation to this? Plato writes, left-hand column of page 388 towards the bottom. And when these terrible enchanters and tyrant makers have no hope of keeping hold of the young man in any other way, they contrive to implant a powerful passion in him, as the popular leader of those idle and profligate appetites, a sort of great winged drone. And when the other appetites come buzzing around, filled with incense, perfumes, wreaths, wines, and all the other pleasures found in such company, they feed the drone and make it grow as large as possible, and plant the sting of longing in it. Then this popular leader of the soul adopts madness as its bodyguard and is stung to frenzy. If it finds any beliefs or appetites in the man that are regarded as good or are still moved by shame, it destroys them and throws them out, until it has purged him of temperance and filled him with an imported madness. So in short, Plato sees the tyrannical type of man as arising from giving in to these various lawless appetites that are buzzing around and trying to seduce and enchant the young man. And the person becomes given over to these. It develops, as we would say, an addiction to these lawless appetites. And it doesn't necessarily have to be drugs here. I mean, this could be an addiction to luxury goods, to jewelry, clothing, and the like, or intoxicants, or lavish partying, or sex, or very likely all of the above. Because what he's describing here is what we might think of as an addictive personality, a person who is prone to becoming addicted to all of these different things that can seduce the soul and induce it to a kind of madness. And so the tyrant is formed, the personality of the tyrant is formed in this way, as a person driven to feed his insatiable, immoderate appetites. Because of his appetites, the tyrannical type has a whole host of needs that demand to be satisfied. And these are needs that more moderate types lack. And just as in the case of the addict, there's no act that's too shameful, no law that cannot be broken if it will satisfy the addict's insatiable cravings, so too for the tyrant. To satisfy his need, the tyrant looks quote, to see who possesses anything that can be taken from him by deceit or force, unquote. That's 573E, where that quote comes from. So you can see that the transition from having insatiable appetites to becoming unjust. I need to fulfill my appetites. I need to get money to do this. So I look around and see who I can victimize. Who can I defraud? Who can I rob so I can get money to fill my appetites? So the tyrannical type of personality becomes a con man and a robber in order to acquire money to fill his insatiable appetites. Eventually, the terrible and lawless passions that for most people are released only in sleep, if at all, become his waking reality. And he goes in for matricide and parricide. You think here of, stories, these tragic stories you hear of, children perhaps assaulting their parents, maybe even murdering their parents in order to get money for drugs and things like that. So he goes in for matricide and parricide. He goes in for burglary, robbery, temple robbery, right? He goes into the steal from the collection plate at church, so to speak, kidnapping and everything else of that order. So the tyrannical type also naturally forms alliances with other people like him, creating a gang of hooligans to terrorize the city. The tyrant grows in power as the number of such gang members grows in the city. If they're just a small number, they're nothing more than a nuisance. However, if they're a large number, the leader of such a gang may become an admired person. Admired by foolish people, but an admired person. Think how famous gangsters become folk heroes, oftentimes. Or if you look at the 1980s movie, The Untouchables, with Kevin Costner, Robert De Niro, Sean Connery. Some of you may have seen that. It depicts the city of Chicago, basically controlled by Al Capone. That's a perfect example of the kind of process that Plato has in mind. The person comes to become a kind of political force in the city by collecting other people with these sort of lawless appetites and lawless personalities around him. And then the tyrant becomes a political player. And sometimes this can reach a very large scale. Think of the infamous narco Pablo Escobar, narco-terrorist Pablo Escobar from the 80s and 90s. Forget exactly the time period. 80s, I think, who was elected to Congress in Colombia. So that's the trajectory that Plato's imagining here. Although the tyrant may seem to live a life of pleasure and excitement and power, in reality, his life is sad. Page 390 in the left-hand column, Plato writes, "So isn't this what such men are like in private life before they start to rule? In the first place, don't they associate with flatterers who are ready to do anything to serve them? Or if they need something from someone themselves, won't they grovel and willingly engage in any sort of posturing the way slaves do? But once they get what they need, isn't it a different story altogether? Yes, completely different. So those of the tyrannical nature live their entire lives without ever being friends with anyone. Always masters to one man or slaves to another, but never getting a taste of freedom or true friendship." The tyrant is a user, or someone who allows himself to be used in order to satisfy his appetites. And so he's never really a friend. That's the sadness of this kind of life. Now, tyranny, it would follow, is the worst condition for either a man or a city, just as aristocracy is the best. Plato argues that the worst condition is also the unhappiest, just as the best condition is the happiest, rather. This is page 390R, right-hand column. Well, it might seem from outer appearances that the tyrant leads a happy life. We need to look beneath the surface and into the inner depths of the man's internal psychological life in order to see if he's truly happy. And Plato will try to depict the internal psychological constitution of a tyrant as like that of a tyrannized city. which, as we saw last time, is the unhappiest state that the city can be in, where everyone is enslaved and oppressed. So look on page 391 in the left-hand column towards the bottom. If a man and his city are similar, then mustn't the same structure exist in him too? Mustn't his soul be full of slavery and illiberality, with those same parts of it enslaved? Well, a small part, the most wicked and most insane, is master. Just like in the tyrannized city, you have this single individual, this tyrant, who's an insane person, sometimes more obviously than others, like the case of Hitler, but is enslaving and oppressing everyone else. And that's what's going on inside the soul of the tyrant himself. The smallest part here, though, I mean, there's a little bit of inconsistency in Plato, because elsewhere he'll describe the appetites as the largest part. But maybe he's thinking here just of the subset of the appetites, namely the lawless appetites. So that's the most insane part. The lawless appetites are tyrannizing over all the rest of his soul, including his reason. So his reason only exists in order to figure out, for example, schemes for defrauding people, or doing things like, planning burglaries or planning assassinations. That's the use of reason in the tyrant. It serves as the slave to the tyrant's lawless appetites. So the tyrant's soul is unfree because it's enslaved by its unruly and lawless passions, which require him to meet their demands incessantly. He never gets a day off or relief from these demands of the insatiable lawless appetites. Because if they go unmet, then he suffers terribly. Think of an addict undergoing withdrawal. Likewise, just as a tyrannical city is ruled by fear, so too is the tyrant's soul. He lives in constant fear of his enemies and fear of losing his possessions. And in this vivid image or thought experiment, Plato says, imagine a man who has many slaves, who is lifted, teleported, we could say today, with his family and his slaves and placed in some remote desert somewhere. Wouldn't he instantly be overcome with anxiety and panic that his slaves would murder him and so forth? And just like this man, the tyrant is really at the mercy of the people who are like his slaves. And to keep them in check, he has to constantly court and curry favor with them, or generate fear in them. And so he lives in this constant state of hostile tension with the citizens, and in a constant state of anxiety lest they turn and victimize him. And this shows that although he seems to be the freest of men, in actuality, a tyrant is in a prison. His soul is imprisoned by his passions, and his body is imprisoned in the city where he's surrounded by potential enemies that he constantly has to assuage. So Socrates summarizes the pitiful state of the tyrant as follows on page 392 in the right-hand column. So in truth then, and whatever some people may think, a real tyrant is really a slave to the worst sorts of fawning and slavery, and a flatterer of the worst kind of people. He is so far from satisfying his appetites in any way that he is in the greatest need of most things and truly poor, as is apparent if one knows how to look at a whole soul. He is full of fear throughout his life and overflowing with convulsions and pains, if in fact his condition is like that of the city he rules. So there's a kind of reversal here that Plato's pointing to. People think, the tyrant, he's top of the heap. This is the person who's got all the power and he's got control over everyone. But in actuality, since the tyrant has to rule by fear and by cajoling, he's got to be constantly fawning and flattering the people, the masses, in order to keep them on his side, lest they revolt against him. And so he's really like a slave to the people. He can't afford to have the people turn against him, so he has to be constantly flattering them, constantly cajoling them, constantly buttering them up, and so forth. And similarly, people think the tyrant is rich. This tyrant, look at the lavish palaces and all these things. that the tyrant has. However, as Plato imagines it, the tyrant has need for all of these things and more. And so he's actually, in a psychological sense, more impoverished than the moderate person who has limited needs and therefore needs that are easily satisfied and doesn't want more. Who's the person who's really impoverished? The person whose needs are unmet. And so it doesn't really matter how much stuff you have. What matters, psychologically speaking now, not just in terms of outward, material disposition. Who cares about that? What people envy, presumably, is the inner psychological state of the supposed happiness of the tyrant. But a person who, even though they've got lots of stuff, feels like they don't have enough, isn't benefiting from their material wealth. And so really, psychologically, they're impoverished. That's the idea. Okay, so at this point, Socrates believes he's answered the original question raised by Glaucon way back in Book 2. And so the trajectory from Book 2 to Book 9 is closed here, although, as we'll see, Plato will add additional arguments, but the first closure to this trajectory is accomplished here. If you look on the very bottom of the right-hand column of 292 in 580a, and then continuing on to the left-hand column of page 393 in our text. So Socrates says, "Come on then, and tell me now at last, like the judge who makes the final decision, who you believe is first in happiness and who second, and judge the others similarly, making 5 altogether: kingly, timocratic, oligarchic, democratic, and tyrannical." Glaucon: "That's an easy judgment. You see, I rank them in order of their appearance, just as if they were choruses, both in virtue and vice, and in happiness and its opposite." Socrates: "Shall we then hire a herald, or shall I myself announce that the son of Ariston has given his verdict that the best and most just is the most happy, and that he is the one who is most kingly and rules like a king over himself, whereas the worst and most unjust is the most wretched, and he again is the one who, because he is most tyrannical, is the greatest tyrant over himself and his city?" Glaucon: "You have announced it." Socrates: "And shall I add that it holds whether or not their characters remain hidden from all human beings and gods?" Glaucon: "Do add it." So we see a great rhetorical flourish here where Plato is comparing the final verdict on the comparative happiness of the just man and the unjust man to a contest between tragedians in which the prize is given to the superior individual. And so this is quite clearly the declaration that the task that Glaucon posed for Socrates, namely to show how justice is valued for what it is in itself, and that the just man is happier merely for having justice in his soul than the unjust man who has injustice in his soul. He believes that this has now been accomplished. So the first demonstration, as Socrates refers to it, is this psychological analysis of the 5 character types. And based upon this analysis, the just man is the happiest and the unjust man is proportionally unhappy. So as you fall away from the perfectly just man, who of course is the philosopher king, the different character types become proportionally more and more unhappy until finally you get to the most unjust man, who was the one who was placed in contest with the most just man. You'll recall back in Book 2, is the most unhappy. And so clearly the just man is happier than the unjust man. And that is entirely due to what justice or injustice themselves do in their souls. It's not about the effects or consequences of justice, but purely in terms of the inner psychological effect of justice or injustice in the soul. Okay, this leads to the first discussion question. Do you agree with Plato's description of the nature of the tyrannical character type and the inner life of such a person? Does Plato succeed in showing that such a person would be much less happy than a just person? Why or why not? Once again, first discussion question. Do you agree with Plato's description of the nature of the tyrannical character type and the inner life of such a person? Does Plato succeed in showing that such a person would be much less happy than a just person? Why or why not? Now, Plato does not content himself with his first demonstration alone. He provides two additional arguments to show that the just man is happier than the unjust man. The second argument is based upon the division of the soul into three classes. The three parts, which are described at 480 D through E, the left-hand column of page 393 in our text. The three parts are the part with which the person learns, the part with which the person feels anger, and the appetitive element. And this, of course, is a repeat of the points he made earlier in the work. They seem to more or less correspond to the reason or intellect, the rationally calculating part of the soul, the spirited part of the soul, and the appetites. So there are these three parts of the soul. Next, Plato makes the point that each of these parts of the soul has a distinctive love and a distinctive pleasure. So the part with which the person learns loves learning and takes pleasure in knowing the truth about things. The part with which a person learns is directed towards taking pleasure in knowing the truth about things and takes pleasure in learning. That seems pretty straightforward. And likewise, the part with which the person feels anger is spirited and loves honor and takes pleasure in victories. This might be less obvious for us, but if you think of anger here as just like the getting worked up over things, and think about the way in which people get worked up over competitive sports, either as a spectator or as a participant. That's the idea, basically. That's the spirited part. So the spirited part in the sense of team spirit, school spirit, that sense of spirit. And that's why it's connected with anger. It's connected with that kind of competitive anger, aggressiveness that loves honor and loves to have victories. This is the part that takes the greatest pleasure in being able to say, we're number one, we're number one. Okay? So that's the second part, the spirited part. So the part that is concerned with learning takes pleasure in truth and knowledge, acquiring truth and knowledge. And the part that feels anger, the spirited part, loves honors and taking pleasures and victories. Again, pretty straightforward. And then finally, the appetitive element loves profits and money and takes pleasure in acquiring those things, which is sort of a stand-in, of course, for satisfying the various appetites, because money is able to buy you things to satisfy your appetites. So, but that's the way Plato tends to frame it, is the appetitive part loves money more than anything else. So you have basically the three things that each of these three parts of the soul are directed towards: knowledge and truth, victory and honors, and money and profits. Socrates goes on to observe that there are three types of people who differ according to which part of their soul is most active. The most active part is the one that determines their conception of pleasure. For instance, the money-making part, he says, this is the bottom right-hand corner of 393. The person who is dominated by the money-making part of their soul will say that compared to that of making a profit, the pleasures of being honored or of learning are worthless unless there's something in them that makes money. And similarly for the honor lover, the learning lover, or the philosopher. Right? We're familiar with this attitude. Someone says, well, why, a parent says to a child, you're majoring in philosophy. I mean, how are you going to make any money with that? Right? That is, this expresses the attitude of a person who thinks that the only thing that is worth pursuing in life is money, because compared to the pleasures of having a fat bank account, the pleasures of knowing what Plato's Republic says is worthless. And similarly, someone might say, the honor lover is going to have a similar kind of attitude. if this isn't going to help us win, what do we care for it? Money might be good, but money's only good if it helps us win. Philosophy and knowledge might be good, but they're only good if they help us win. And similarly, the philosopher is going to disdain victory for victory's sake or money if they're not instruments in the service of acquiring knowledge. So the three kinds of lives dispute with one another as to which of them is really the most pleasant. This naturally raises the question, of these three possibilities, which of them is really the most pleasant? Is it possible to answer this question, or must we leave it as an unresolved dispute? Plato evidently believes that it is possible to answer, and he puts forth the following argument on page 394 in our text, from 381d through 383a. So here's the argument. Premise 1. If we want to judge something, call it X, we should appeal to the individuals who have the most experience of X. So premise 1, if we want to judge something, call it X, we should appeal to the individuals who have the most experience of X. Premise 2. Thus, if we want to judge which pleasure is best, we should appeal to the individuals who have the most experience of pleasure. Premise 2. Thus, if we want to judge which pleasure is best, we should appeal to the individuals who have the most experience of pleasure. Premise 3. Of the three types of person, the philosopher, the victory lover, and the money lover, only the philosopher has experienced all three types of pleasure. So premise 3, of the three types of person, only the philosopher has experienced all three types of pleasure. Premise 4. Hence, of the three types of person, the philosopher has the most experience of pleasure. Premise 4. Hence, of the three types of person, the philosopher has the most experience of pleasure. Premise 5. The philosopher judges the pleasure in learning to be most choice-worthy of the three types. Premise 5. The philosopher judges pleasure in learning to be the most choice-worthy of the three types. More choice-worthy, that is, than the pleasures in victories or the pleasure in money. Conclusion. The pleasure in learning is the best of the three types. So once again, here's the argument from the top. If we want to judge something, we should appeal to the individuals who have the most experience of it. Thus, if we want to judge which pleasure is best, we should appeal to the individuals who have the most experience of pleasure. Of the three types of person, only the philosopher has experienced all three types of pleasure. Hence, of the three types of person, the philosopher has the most experience of pleasure. The philosopher judges the pleasure in learning to be the most choice-worthy of the three types. Therefore, the pleasure in learning is the best of the three types. Now, what about the justification for premise 3? Why does Plato think the philosopher is the only one who has experienced all three types of pleasure? Maybe this is pretty obvious, but Plato reasoned that everyone has experienced the pleasures that go along with having money and being able to spend money from a young age. So not only the money lover, but also the honor lover and the philosopher have experienced what it's like to have money and be able to spend it. In part, you might say, well, wait a minute, what about people who are poor and so on? Well, even people who are poor have experienced the pleasures that money can buy. Maybe they've experienced a smaller quantity or lower quality of such pleasures, but they understand we're basically just dealing here with the pleasures of the senses and so forth. So they've experienced that too. maybe in a lesser quantity or lower quality, but they've experienced that too. So everyone's experienced what appetitive pleasures, appetite-based pleasures, pleasures based in satisfying the appetites are like. Also, the philosopher has experienced what it's like to receive honors. So the philosopher is a person who is characteristically going to be intellectually accomplished, and so is accustomed to being honored, let's say with scholarships, academic prizes, and so on, or being regarded as a promising young woman or a promising young man, as the case may be. And so the philosopher is familiar with what it's like to be honored as well. So he has that in common with the honor lover. But they don't have the experience of the pleasure of what it's like to know. And in particular, of course, Plato's thinking here of the highest form of knowledge, the knowledge of the form. It's only the philosopher who achieves this kind of philosophical knowledge, this kind of essential knowledge of the being of things. Other types of people may achieve a kind of belief, but they're just dealing with the shadows on the wall of the cave. They don't have the true knowledge. They don't know what it's like to really experience, for example, the form of the beautiful itself. What a rapturous pleasure this is to have this kind of knowledge, to have this kind of insight into reality. So that's the idea. So that might be disputed, of course, that this is a kind of higher form of pleasure that only the philosopher has, but this is the claim. In addition to this, Plato asserts that the philosopher is able to make a judgment of the superiority of his type of pleasure by means of arguments. So Plato's point seems to be that the philosopher doesn't judge the superiority of the pleasure of learning merely by some vague personal or subjective feeling. His judgment is underwritten by rational argument based upon objective metaphysical principles. And this, arguably, is why he needs a third argument. The third argument, which begins around 583b, page 395 in our text in the upper left-hand column, is this kind of philosophical argument based upon what pleasure is in itself, based upon a philosophical understanding of what pleasure is. And he introduces this argument as follows. Left-hand column, page 395. The other pleasures, apart from that of the knowledgeable person, are neither entirely true nor pure. On the contrary, they are like some sort of illusionist painting, as I think we have heard some wise persons say. Yet, if that were true, it would be the greatest and most decisive of the overthrows. So this is the claim now. It's not just that you have these three classes of pleasure. The philosopher has experienced all three. The philosopher is unique among the different types of people in that he's the only one of the three types who has experienced all three types of pleasure, and so his judgment is superior. Now we're getting at a deeper form of argument and a stronger claim, which is that the other pleasures, the pleasures of the honor or victory lover and the pleasures of the person who tries to satisfy the appetites, are really illusory pleasures. They're not real pleasures. They're a kind of ersatz pleasure or pseudo pleasure. That's the claim. Okay, so how is he going to prove this? Well, to begin with, he introduces the idea that pain is the opposite of pleasure. So you have pleasure and pain, and these are opposite and opposed to one another. That he would take to be an uncontroversial point. But he says, is that all there is? Are these the only two states that we're in, such that we're either always in a state of pleasure or we're in a state of pain? So this kind of a binary opposition, an exclusive choice, so that such that if I ask you at any moment in time, are you in pleasure or are you in pain, you would have to say one or the other. Those are the only two choices, like a light switch that either has to be on or off. Is that the way it is? And he gets his interlocutor, who's still Glaucon at this point, to agree that, actually, no, that's not the case. There's a middle state. Which he calls the state of indifference. In between pleasure and pain. So this indifferent state, switch this, call this the indifferent state. So there's the state of pleasure, the state of pain, and the indifferent state, which is neither pleasure nor pain. That's in between. So that's the first point. There are these three states. Second, when people in pain move from a state of being in pleasure to the state in which that pain ceases, let me say that again. When people in pain move from the state of being in pain, from the state of being in pain to the state in which that pain ceases, namely to the indifferent state, they often experience this as most pleasant. So we can describe this way. There's a movement now. So this refers to the arrow. These are states. These are sort of like stopping points, right? Being in the state of pain, being in the indifferent state, being in a state of pleasure. He says that when I move from the state of pain to the indifferent state, that's why I've colored this green here, it's the feeling of pleasure. But there's still a question as to whether this is really pleasure. And ultimately, he's going to say that it's not. It's actually just the arrival at the indifferent state. It's not true pleasure. True pleasure is here. This feeling, since it's merely a feeling, we'll put that mere feeling here, mere feeling of pleasure, is really a kind of pseudo pleasure. Right? Because what is it? What is it really? Well, really, it's the movement from the state of being in pain to the indifferent state. But since, of course, we would call this relief, right? Your pain is being relieved. And so you're arriving at this indifferent state, and that creates a kind of feeling as if it were pleasure, but it's not real pleasure. It's because real pleasure is up here, this state. This is just a kind of pseudo pleasure, the movement from pain to the indifferent state. Okay? And of course, as we would expect, a similar thing could be said when one is in a feeling of pleasure and then you have to come down from the pleasure, right? When the buzz wears off. This is experienced as painful. You're in a euphoric state. You're experiencing some kind of high, whether chemically induced or induced through natural activity, and then you come back down to your normal state. And this is going to be experienced as pain, but again, in an exactly parallel situation. This is the mere feeling of pain or a pseudo pain. Okay? So this movement, it's not real. This isn't real pain coming down from your high, because what you're doing is just you're transferring from a state of pleasure to an indifferent state, and the real pain is down here. So that's the picture he's imagining. So we have really 5 possibilities here. There's true pleasure, the indifferent state, and true pain. And then there's a pseudo pleasure that consists in moving from the state of pain to the indifferent state. But it's pseudo pleasure because you never actually reach actual pleasure. You're just moving to the indifferent state from a state of pain. And then there's pseudo pain, which involves moving from the state of pleasure to the indifferent state. But it's not actual pain because you never really reach this state of pain. You're just moving from pleasure to the indifferent state. So that's the theory of pleasure, kind of metaphysics of pleasure and pain that Plato is sketching out here at this point. So what does this have to do with the question as to whether the philosopher's pleasures are superior? Well, when pleasure and pain arise in the soul, they're both a sort of motion, he says. On the right-hand column, page 395. Now that which is neither painful nor pleasant is a respite and a middle between the two. How can it be right then to think that the absence of pain is pleasant or the absence of enjoyment painful? Glaucon, there's no way it can be. Socrates, so it's not right. And when the quiet state, that's another term for this indifferent state, the quiet state, is next to what is painful, it appears pleasant. And when it is next to what is pleasant, it appears painful. And there is nothing sound in these illusions as far as the truth about pleasure is concerned. On the contrary, they're sort of sorcery. So these are, he will call this the illusion of pleasure. And this would then be also the illusion of pain because, again, real pleasure is above this indifferent state, which is the stopping point of this motion in the soul from pain to the indifferent state, which never reaches pleasure. So so-called pleasures and pains that reflect these experiences of ceasing to suffer, ceasing to enjoy something, are not truly pleasures or pains. They're the absence of pleasure and pain. They're illusions. They're not real. They're illusions of pleasure and pain. Some experiences that people might call pleasures are actually the mere cessations of pains, and thus they're not true pleasures at all. And thus there must be some other kinds of things that are the true pleasures. What are these? What are these true pleasures then that aren't just of this sort? Well, one example he gives is pleasures of smell. Without being preceded by pain, they suddenly become incredibly intense, and then they leave no pain behind. So it's springtime here in the southwestern United States. You open the door with the dry air. You can smell the air and the flowers and so on. And you might find this immediately pleasant. You weren't in a state of pain. That pain, or if you were, it's not relieved by your smelling the flowers. But nonetheless, this experienced as a kind of immediate pleasure. And when you go back into the house, you cease to experience those smells. That doesn't cause you any pain. So that's an example of a pure pleasure. It doesn't need to be preceded by pain. And its absence doesn't cause pain. However, even though smell is the example of a bodily pleasure that is of this type, most bodily pleasures are not of this type. And in the most intense ones in particular are merely relief from pains. So most bodily pleasures are of this kind here. They involve a motion from a state of pain to an indifferent state, and that is creates an illusion of pleasure, a mere feeling of pleasure, kind of pseudo-pleasure. Hunger and thirst are going to be like this because, of course, hunger and thirst are painful. And they seem, in order to experience pleasures in eating and drinking, it seems that you need to have some degree of hunger and thirst. If you're completely full, you won't enjoy eating, right? So you need to have that pain, and that makes it plausible to think that it's the relief of that pain that's really the source of this feeling of pleasure that's really just a kind of illusion of pleasure. Okay. So consequently, people who have only experienced this type of pleasure are like people who have traveled to a middle region but believe that they're in an upper region. People who've only experienced bodily pleasures never really experience true pleasure because they only get this far. Although presumably they experience smells. So how that fits in with Plato's account is a bit of a question, but the point is that for the most part, those people who chase after bodily pleasures aren't chasing after the pleasure of smells. Maybe there are some people who are, into perfume as their main thing, but for the most part, people are into other kinds of bodily pleasures, and that goes from the painful state to the indifferent state. They never get up to the upper level of pleasure. Socrates pursues an alternative track to show that the pleasures of the body are not as real as the pleasures of the philosopher. He says on the bottom right of page 396, which of the two types then partakes more of pure being? The sorts belonging to bread, drink, relishes, and nourishment in general, or the kind belonging to true belief, knowledge, understanding, and in some to all of virtue? Judge it in this way. What belongs to what is always the same, immortal, and true, is itself of that sort, and comes to be in something of that sort. It is more, don't you think, than what belongs to what is never the same and mortal, is itself of that kind, and comes to be in something of that kind. This is kind of an obscure passage, but it's going to frame the idea of pleasure as a sort of filling up. This way of construing pleasure is prepared for by the previous account of those illusory pleasures which are just sensations of pain. The pleasures of eating and drinking are prime examples of this. And in both cases, the pleasure results from the filling up of an emptiness. But in this passage, Plato suggests that if this is so in the case of the pleasures of eating and drinking, that is, that their pleasurableness consists in there being a filling up, then if there is a more complete filling up, this would be a greater pleasure. And it just so happens that the pleasures of learning and coming to know also involve a filling up. However, if the knowing involved is true philosophical knowing, then it involves a filling up with true being, rather than with something like food or drink, which is merely transitory and perishing. Thus, it would follow that learning and knowing involve a more complete form of filling than eating and drinking. And so if we conceive of pleasure as filling, this is a more adequate form of pleasure. So Plato believes that he has decisively shown in this way that the life of the just man is a more pleasurable, satisfying, and fulfilling life of the unjust man, because it is true and full pleasure. It's the true fullness of being that one attains in coming to know, and especially coming to contemplate the forms. All right, so in sum then, we have Plato's general account of the superiority of the philosophical, psychological type over the unphilosophical or appetite-driven type. That's one of his arguments for the greater happiness of the just man over the unjust man. But this is supplemented and really buttressed through a direct metaphysical argument by this metaphysics of pleasure that we've just covered, which tries to show how the pleasures of knowledge that are characteristic of the philosopher, and indeed are only enjoyed by the philosopher, are truer and purer pleasures because they involve a greater fulfillment. And they involve a greater fulfillment because what they fill us with is true reality. So ultimately, this account of the superiority of the just man over the unjust man with respect to happiness is deeply rooted in Plato's theory of the forms, because it's because of that theory that he has the idea of the superior being that the philosopher possesses. And that, I think, is indeed a central pillar of Plato's answer to Glaucon from Book 2. All right, so we'll conclude our discussion of the Republic here in Book 9 with the second discussion question. Which, if any, of Plato's arguments for the superiority of the pleasures enjoyed by the philosopher over those enjoyed by the honor lover and the money lover are successful arguments in your view? Which of these arguments we've just gone through are successful arguments? And justify your answer. So once again, which, if any, of Plato's arguments for the superiority of the pleasures enjoyed by the philosopher over those enjoyed by the honor lover and the money lover, are successful in your view? Justify your answer.